It's the week ending Saturday the 19th of August, and this is The Week Unwrapped. In the past 7 days, we've seen Donald Trump indicted in Georgia over efforts to overturn the results of the 2020 election, England's Lionesses defeating Australia to reach the final of the FIFA Women's World Cup, and the death of TV great Sir Michael Parkinson at the age of 88. You can read all you need to know about everything that matters in The Week magazine, but we're here to bring you some stories that passed under the radar this week. Big news not making headlines right now, but with repercussions for all our lives. I'm Olly Mann. Let's unwrap the week. And joining me today from the week's digital team is Rebekah Evans, and Parky's inevitable replacement in the nation's hearts, Jamie Timson. And from the Spectator's Chinese Whispers podcast, it's Cindy Yu. Cindy, you're up first. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
This is the week that people rage against the machine.
At Ryanair, we love flying you and your family. Wherever you'd like to go, our friendly crew are happy to care for you. Fly Ryanair and you love our low fares, on-time flights and sunshine destinations. Don't delay. Book your summer break today to get our low fares before they sell out. Ryanair. Low fares. Great care.
A bright and breezy commercial there for budget airline Ryanair. They sound great, Cindy. What could possibly go wrong?
They do sound great, except for the fact that their low fares, great care slogan didn't really come into play for an elderly couple who were trying to go to France recently. They went to Stansted and they were charged £110 in order to get their boarding passes printed.
Why?
Apparently this is policy because Ryanair in the last few years have basically launched this app. So you're meant to get your boarding pass on your app, or you're meant to get it downloaded onto your phone otherwise beforehand. Now, this couple downloaded the return boarding pass, not the one to France. And instead of getting, just correcting the mistake very easily, I mean, I don't know about you, Ollie, but I often get people to print my boarding passes for me at no extra charge. The Ryanair desk was very much, computer says no. And so what I saw in the story was an elderly couple, they're 79 and 80, who didn't really understand the tech around it, weren't very digital, didn't really enjoy the smartphone life, trying to get people to help, and really just meeting a wall and actually being charged a lot of money for it. Now, listeners might say this is no surprise from Ryanair because there's a catch to the low fare stuff, and we all know that. But even so, £110 for 2 pieces of paper is ridiculous.
And Ryanair, Jamie, have been defending this policy on social media. They've been saying, look, it is in our terms and conditions. I'm paraphrasing, but essentially, we regret that this couple failed to follow our procedures rather than we're really sorry that we inconvenienced a 79 and 80-year-old, and obviously this technological solution isn't appropriate for them. Do you think that's the right tack?
I'm a big fan of Ryanair taking up this kind of... we need more kind of outwardly evil corporations, Like we do just need, let's, call a spade in this regard and say, we're not great people, but we will get you to a destination for cheaper than everyone else. I do have obviously a lot of sympathy with this elderly couple. It is mad that you have to pay £110, but I do also see Ryanair's point, and actually in a way I'm pretty happy that they've lent into it and been like, this is on our terms and conditions, this is on our website, because if they'd kind of backtracked and been like, oh, we'll refund them or whatever, it makes a mockery of their whole business model, doesn't it?
Well, what is that business model though, Rebekah, really, when you're talking about the finances here? Because I think we can all understand, they're not like the national carriers. They are cheaper. And so everything's a bolt-on. Everything costs more. If you don't download your own boarding passes, you have to pay for that. That bit is understandable. It's the eye-watering price they were prepared to, with a straight face, charge someone. That's ridiculous for printing out a piece of paper. I mean, what does that cost them? £10, no one would be complaining, would they?
Sure. I mean, it just does seem a bit ridiculous and excessive, £110 to, essentially just press a button on a computer and use a printer. It's a bit shocking, really. But, I think the fee in and of itself is obviously excessive, and Ryanair are, as Jamie says, sticking to their guns and saying that they have a policy. But I just feel like there's a whiff of ageism about this, almost as if they're trying to catch out, older people and those who are less internet literate. Surely an exception can be made in the case where someone's genuinely made a mistake.
I mean, I suppose, Jamie, that's where I come back to my question about the PR strategy around this. You almost wonder whether Ryanair sit around their boardroom and say, well, we're not an airline for old people. So let's really lean into that. You know, the people that were in the advert we just saw were a young family. That's who we're for. We're cheap, we're cheerful, you know how to use the internet. Is that discrimination, or is that just them knowing their market?
No, and I think you're right. And you only have to take a look at their social media feed. You know, they're one of the most antagonistic brands on Twitter. That, you know, they'll take anyone on about the kind of the arguments or quibbles that you have with the way that they run their business. I think, you know, Michael O'Leary, who's the chief exec of Ryanair, has for a long time basically said, you know, yes, we're a no-frills airline, and that's the way it'll always be. And I mean, in the last year, their kind of profits have gone through the roof. They've been the ones that have bounced back after the pandemic. So as a kind of country, we're saying, yeah, actually, or, you know, as a Europeans across the continent, we're saying, yeah, actually, this is who we are. You know, the price is the most important thing.
But actually, Cindy, you see this as a broader trend and not just about a company like Ryanair, where sort of that's their brand value, but when it comes to services, even those provided by the government.
Yes, Rebecca hit the nail on the head for me, I think, which is it's about ageism. It's about older people not being able to adapt to a more digital society where, you know, all of us on this call probably are perfectly happy to have our boarding passes on our phones with a QR code, happy to use our apps for various purchases and all that sort of stuff. But for elderly people, that can be difficult, understandably. And it's a broader trend because we're in this political debate at the moment about whether or not to close ticket offices in stations across the UK. The government has decided to close most railway ticket offices, and that's something that has actually united both backbenchers in the Labour and the Conservative Party in saying this is going to be really bad for elderly people and those more vulnerable like disabled people. You just sometimes need a human face to talk to. And Olly, the reason it's been particularly on my mind is because in July I went to China and I spent a few weeks there. And China is a very cashless society these days. You use your app, you use your phone basically to pay for everything. But where does that leave people who are in their 50s, in their 60s and beyond, who don't like to use their phone, who prefer to have a banknote? And what I found actually was when I was traveling around as a young person, so many people just came up to me to ask me, excuse me, how do you do this? How do you do that? And without people like me around and without the officers of personnel in these stations, elderly people were really struggling in this much more cashless society. And I see the UK going in that direction, and I don't want that to happen. I'm not overly sentimental about older things at all, but I think where it's, you know, going to exclude certain demographics, I think that's a real problem.
That's really interesting because you've spoken before on this show about how China, as a society, tends to respect older people more than our societies in Europe. How has it come to pass that there are people there that feel alienated? That seems antithetical to the whole way things are structured.
So, Olly, it's a great question. I think what's happened is that there have been multiple forces at play here. In China, the cashless society has come about because fintech really took off maybe about 10 years ago, I would say, such that people can just use their phones to pay for things in a way that we find it very hard to understand here. But it's a bit like Apple Pay, but even more advanced. The reason that took off is because people didn't really take off with bank cards. So people actually didn't really have bank cards, and that meant that when the next thing came along, they just adopted that. They just skipped a generation. Now, that has made China very, very cashless. At the same time as, you know, this is a very Confucian society, we do care a lot about older people. So the government has basically said it has made it illegal to refuse the use of cash. So if you're a taxi driver or if you're a shop, legally speaking, you have to take cash. But because so many people use cashless systems, it can be quite clunky in insisting on using cash. And then there are other things such as QR codes and all this sort of stuff that came into China way before the pandemic, which basically just left people behind in a very quick and natural way. The government is trying to make moves to kind of bring older people back. But, you know, frankly, this tech is here to stay for China.
And I suppose, Rebecca, you know, there's a little bit of training, isn't there? And there's a little bit of experience that people can insist on giving themselves to make them a bit more competent with modern technology that should be expected. But then there are some people that simply would never be able to use new technology.
Well, exactly. I think this is a really important point when it comes to the closure of ticket offices. We're not just looking at elderly people who are being affected by this, but also people who are disabled and learning disabled. I feel like it's really important to listen to disabled people on this particular topic. Many disabled people don't feel like they have a voice, so it's important to hear what their perspective and where they're coming from. Now, if neurotypical people find it difficult to navigate the interfaces of these, machines that are replacing ticket offices, this could be amplified for someone that has those additional challenges. Disability Rights UK has said that such policy is a slippery slope to unmanned stations. And I think that's a really important point to consider, because if there's no staff around, who can help?
Is unmanned stations what is being proposed, though? Because the trades unions are making it sound like that's the case. But is it the case that what they're actually saying at the moment, the government, is we're going to take people off the ticket offices, which aren't always popular, and put them on the train platforms, and maybe they can still sell tickets on machines or whatever, and they can help people in other ways?
No, sure, exactly. I think that's what's being proposed at the moment. But what these disability rights campaigners are saying is might be the first step on a journey towards machine-only stations.
And that puts Conservative voters on the same side as Labour voters in many ways, Jamie, and that's an interesting place for the government to be, isn't it? Where some backbenchers are obviously on the same side as the trade unions.
Yeah, I think what's interesting, and certainly from putting my old DfT hat on, the way that they were defending it, certainly when I was there, was this idea that, all train tickets were sold via ticket offices in the 1990s, and now it's only 1 in 10. And also the other aspect of it is that they have gone through these processes in the London Underground. I wouldn't be surprised, though, like you say, because of this kind of quite cross-party anger towards it. I wouldn't be surprised if this was another one of those U-turns that comes down the track and they end up defending it, because ultimately Boris Johnson's 70-odd seat majority in 2019 was based on the kind of backing of a certain number of people that will be very closely affected by this issue. So yeah, I wouldn't be surprised to see that change.
Yeah, so the people that might be affected by the issue are the sort of working and lower middle class people who might be working in the ticket offices. But Cindy, what about the voters who are older, who naturally veer towards the Conservatives? Why would Rishi Sunak be pushing this when he needs every one of those he can get?
I think it's one of those treasury brain things that Rishi Sunak's critics often levy against him. It's in the pursuit of efficiency and modernity. And, in these years of striking in the railways, we've talked a lot about ways in which the system can be modernized. This seems to be a part of that package, but I actually think it's not part of that package, because it's not more modern just to get rid of human beings in ticket offices. And we've seen that in so many different areas. We've seen that in the healthcare services as well, where GP, phone appointments for GPs or video appointments just don't work for older people, for certain demographics. Rarely do I agree with a backbench Conservative MP Tim Loughton, but here I agree with him when he says it's not going to work, is it?
Okay, well, on that bombshell, Jamie, you're up next after this. Okay, Jamie, your turn. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
This was the week we called Time on Another Gender Gap.
Alcohol use is being normalized amongst women, and so we're seeing the gap narrowing amongst all age groups. Especially younger women and teenage women are now increasing their use of alcohol far more than they used to. Marketing is targeting women for their alcohol use. They're doing this in very clever ways, and it's being effective. Women are experiencing more stress, I think, and stress-related drinking as a result. And then I think the effects of social media has had its effect on women increasing drinking as well.
Dr. Paula Cook, host of the podcast The Addiction Files, speaking to PBS NewsHour. Jamie, what's the story?
So this week, there was kind of a number of reports about a new study that showed that women's alcohol-related mortality rose by 14.7%, which compares to men, which is 12.5%. This is the first time that the women mortality rate from drinking has increased by a higher one than men. And it does seem to tally with previous studies that have shown that men, if you looked in the 1990s, men who had alcohol use disorder there were 5 times as many men. Now it's just gone down to 2 times. It's interesting because you do have to wonder, like, what's causing this. And the expert that we just heard there was talking about marketing and about we're seeing a narrowing in terms of the drinking between men and women across all age groups, but particularly among younger women. In surveys where people are asked to give their reasons for drinking, the biggest change that they're saying, she was saying, is that more women are saying they're drinking to have fun. And, woe betide me to come here and tell people not to drink, because I do like a drink myself. It is interesting that we're now getting into a stage where potentially older women are drinking more, and it does have a kind of massive different effect on women's bodies than male bodies.
I mean, you say we. This is a study from the US, isn't it? Do you think we have similar statistics elsewhere?
I think if you look in Europe as well, it's hard to make kind of massive judgments, but certainly during pandemic lockdowns in 2020, the number of days that women reported drinking to excess, which is 4 or more drinks in a few hours, increased significantly by 41%. I mean, the pandemic is actually a really interesting point as well, because I think people did take on a lot more alcohol during that time. Usually when people are talking about it in Europe and in the UK, there's a thing called the sober curious movement, which certainly among young people is the case. I think there was a recent study about young people just in general, they're wanting to drink less, and is driven. The sober curious movement is driving that move, but it's clearly not making a difference among the older generations that are severely affected.
Yeah, well, that's it, though, isn't it, Rebekah? I mean, of course, it's a concern for anyone to develop alcohol dependency or to be hospitalised with a medical condition relating from drinking. But if we know that coming down the pike, we've got less drinking, it's just that the genders will be roughly drinking as much as each other. Is that necessarily cause for concern? I know that Jamie was being a bit flippant when he was talking about the gender gap closing, but why should men be the only ones drinking? Why can't women drink just the same amount?
Well, I think it ultimately boils down to the science, really, which is a bit dire at the moment from what I've seen. We all want to be able to do the same things regardless of gender, but we have to look at the breakdown of alcohol when it comes to women's bodies. So women's bodies have less water, and that means we can't dilute alcohol as easily. They also have more fat, which retains alcohol. Also, lower metabolic enzymes, meaning alcohol isn't broken down as easily before it gets to the bloodstream. Women are also more vulnerable to serious disease like cardiovascular disease, liver inflammation, and even certain types of cancer. So unfortunately, we really do need to think about the differences between men and women when it comes to basic science and these things.
Why do you think those messages haven't really been communicated, Cindy, to women?
I've never heard of these things until I read this article that Jamie shared. I had no idea. I mean, obviously, you have some idea that your body's being slightly smaller than men, and you know that your tolerance is a bit lower, but I didn't really understand the science behind it. I didn't have any idea that we retain less water. So, yes, other than a rough idea, you probably shouldn't drink as much as men. I don't really think that education is there at all. When we talk about how many units people should be drinking, it's not usually gendered in the message, or at least not emphatically gendered. But maybe I should have just known a bit more about this, because I'm now a bit worried about my drinking habits.
I suppose the issue, Rebekah, is that some men would feel that it was sexist to tell women to drink less, or certainly to point them to research that says, look, your bodies are different. They'd feel uncomfortable about doing that. Don't get me wrong, I realise there are female physicians as well, but you see my point.
No, of course. I definitely see the point. And obviously, the equality between the genders is important, but at the same time, we can't take away from the bottom line of science. And I think, the sexism debate has been seized upon by these marketing companies, as Jamie has discussed earlier. And it's been flipped on its head almost. Marketing of alcohol towards women is focused on friendship and relaxation and empowerment. And it's not new. The tobacco industry has targeted products towards women in the past, where they latched onto the feminist movement in the 60s. So sexism we can kind of see from both sides of the coin, but I think it's just important to kind of realise and accept the facts of this.
Yes, it's actually potentially, Jamie, a sort of sexism to ignore the research that says women are different.
Yes, certainly. I think what's also interesting, and Cindy touched on it, about when you're going to the doctors, actually one of the issues that exacerbate it is that doctors aren't having conversations with women in the same way that they do with men about their drinking. There was a study that again in California that showed that doctors were far less likely to have a conversation with women who had problem levels of drinking than men, and doctors don't know to intervene when women are presenting problems that are potentially alcohol related and to ask them about their drinking. So it is a kind of internalized sexism that exists across society. I did think, to potentially move the conversation on, because obviously it is an issue, whether there is a defense of alcohol in terms of its kind of social qualities, because there is no health benefit to drinking alcohol, despite what everyone seems to think. There isn't, one glass of wine doesn't help you a day, and the Italians, they just live longer. That's all it is. But I think that Professor David Nutt, who was referenced in a Guardian article, is looking to work out a way to create a substitute for alcohol, which is really interesting, a kind of way to get rid of the health negative side of things, but to create a substitute that brings better cooperation and the social side of it. Because, I don't know about you, Ollie, but some of the best times of my life have been under the influence of alcohol.
Kind of makes sense though, Rebekah, doesn't it? He says, asking you as the younger lady here, but it kind of makes sense, doesn't it, in terms of, people going out socializing, when they're in further education, then in their first jobs, then they're going out on dates. All of that does tend, in this country anyway, to involve some consumption of alcohol at some point.
Yeah, sure. I think alcohol, the best way to describe it is that it's a social lubricant, right? It's become a normalized way to kind of wind down, relax, have fun with friends. But I think arguably we all need to evaluate our relationship with alcohol just a bit more. I think particularly in this country, it isn't taken as seriously as what is fundamentally any other drug. And maybe that's the problem. If we started to see our relationship with alcohol as we'd see our relationship with other drugs, then potentially we'd take this all a bit more seriously, and it wouldn't promote such a kind of humorous and lackadaisical relationship with alcohol.
I totally agree with Rebekah. I think there's been research done on how alcohol is actually more damaging to the body than some of the lower class drugs. And if it wasn't for this historical reason that, we have so many, millennia of drinking, fermenting grapes and drinking alcohol, and if it was introduced for the first time ever into society now, people would be really shying away from the damages of it. And I think Professor David Nutt is one of those people who've talked a lot about this kind of stuff as well. So I think it is interesting to note our inconsistencies when it comes to substances, and actually how normalized drinking is, but certain other low-level drugs just seem so far beyond the pale.
It's also interesting, isn't it, Jamie, when you look at the marketing, what booze is being marketed at women? Because, I guess beer, as much as it's gendered, probably skews male, and that's not healthy. But actually, as a man, if you order a glass of wine or a shot of a spirit, that would be par for the course. The stuff that's advertised at women very often is like lurid cocktails with added sugar and calories and all kinds of weird stuff that goes beyond even just the alcohol.
Yeah, there's been a big rise in these hard seltzers. I don't know if you've seen, like White Claw is one of them. And they're kind of marketed as like a particularly, it's all kind of encapsulated in this like horrible diet culture as well of, calorie free, keeping calories low, like all of that is marketed, is so gendered. Arguably that the problem here really lies with the marketing and the ways in which we now associate or are shown, and young people growing up are shown drinking to be, like Rebekah was saying, like a social lubricant and about relaxing and all of that stuff. So maybe that's the real enemy is the marketing rather than the alcohol. But the stat on the young Brits is, the proportion of 16 to 24-year-olds in England who reported monthly drinking has fallen in the last 20 years from 67% to 41%. So young people are drinking less.
Yes, some good news there, at least. Okay, Rebekah, you're up next after this. Okay, Rebekah, you're finishing the show. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
Are children being exposed to sensitive topics in literature too early?
Basically, board books, picture books, early readers, chapter books, all of those books that are kind of through ages 0 to 9, I wouldn't swear at all. I wouldn't even say hell. You can maybe do a heck in chapter book. You can maybe drop a darn. But basically, you have a lot of those gatekeepers, those teachers, librarians, parents, religious leaders, grandparents, kind of really making the purchasing decisions for books of kids that age. You have Scholastic, you have the book fairs, you have all that potential to kind of reach a kid audience. So you have to think a little bit more conservatively about what those gatekeepers are going to want to kind of push on kids.
Author Mary Cole talking about swearing in children's books in a video from the Good Story podcast last year. Rebekah, I think we knew if we're writing a kid's book not to fill it with 4-letter words. But what's the story?
Okay, so this week, a children's book with Princess Diana as the main character has really split opinion. It intends to tackle the late royal's eating disorder, bulimia. And that's led to debate on what material is suitable for children and how we should tackle books with sensitive themes.
Okay. Who says that it is unsuitable to tackle bulimia in some way in a children's book? What's the argument against?
I think it's a really challenging one just because it's such a sensitive topic that I'm sure a lot of people would read this story, particularly parents, and be absolutely horrified. That's not all parents, but a lot of parents would be concerned, shall we say, about their 5 to 9-year-olds, which is who this book is, or who this series is targeted towards, reading about such a sensitive topic. Now, I'm a huge advocate for promoting reading and children exploring through literature. I would be the last person to suggest banning a book. I think that opens up a completely different can of worms. But I do think there does need to be a certain degree of limitation, and books with much more mature themes probably shouldn't be in the hands of very young children.
I mean, my instinct would be, well, don't buy it for your kids then, Cindy. But I suppose when it comes to children's literature, there's an issue, isn't there, around who is putting it in front of your children, whether that's in a school setting or in your local library.
Yeah, I think that's right. And also, kids talk to each other, if it's about a normalization trend. If it becomes more normalized for kids to, for example, be talking about bulimia and what it involves, because I think this book goes into quite a lot of detail. So one quote here says, whenever the princess felt alone, she sought relief by eating all the cake she could find in the royal kitchen. But that sweet feeling of comfort didn't last. Once it was gone, she was trying to get rid of all the food she had eaten by making herself sick. So it's quite descriptive in terms of, and of course a book on bulimia would be descriptive, but as Rebekah says, if you have to go into that amount of detail, there is a risk of normalizing that in terms of kids saying, oh, is that a fun, is that a thing to do? Maybe I should try it out, because it's a bit of an instruction there. Now, I do think that kids are not so impressionable as to try every single thing they read, and it depends on the final message of the book, which I'm sure will be anti-bulimia. But I can see why there might be other ways of getting hard messages across. I mean, children's stories throughout the centuries have always been about getting hard messages across in palatable ways. But using metaphors, presenting evil as a villain, as a villainous wolf or scary stepmother or something like that. There are ways in which to tell that story in metaphors, but not necessarily in precise detail.
I mean, one of my favourite books when I was a kid, Jamie, was George's Marvellous Medicine. I haven't poisoned my grandmother by emptying the contents of everything in the house into a big bowl and mixing it together. She's still around. I love her. Are people just fretting about this unnecessarily? It's not an instruction, is it?
No, and I think I'd be a bit wary of just pulling out excerpts out of context, really. I kind of agree that a lot of these kids aren't going to know who Princess Di is, fundamentally. And so you're just referring to her as a princess. It is obviously going to put her immediately up on a pedestal. They have ideas of what princesses are. So there is a worry that you have to be sensitive about this, but it is worth taking it all in the whole, seeing it within the context of the book, and that would surely be kind of anti-bulimia, as Cindy was saying. I kind of move towards a feeling of like you have to just let children's authors do what they like, and like you say, if they don't want to buy it, don't buy it. If you don't want to put it in front of your kids, then you can police that yourself as a parent. I wouldn't be so worried about it, and I feel like You know, we had this discussion ages ago about Roald Dahl, which I'm sure you must have had an opinion on as you were a favourite, Ollie. But everything needs to be given the context in which it was written, and I think we you know, a kind of knee-jerk reaction to censor and edit is bad. I think maybe perhaps explaining to children that this is what happened and this is the way that it's going. Education is the only way that you get through to kids, and providing the context of all different kinds of issues is incredibly important. I would say that you can't just remove or adapt.
Except, Rebekah, you can remove and adapt. I mean, that is exactly what children's publishers are doing now, isn't it?
No, exactly. I mean, we've seen, as Jamie identifies, this kind of ongoing debate about the lexical choices of authors that are near and dear to a lot of our hearts, like Roald Dahl and Enid Blyton. I read them growing up. I enjoyed them growing up as far as I can recall. I think we do have to acknowledge that these authors are a product of their time. I mean, in instances where language is implicitly or even explicitly racist or homophobic or sexist, I'd kind of be inclined to agree with changes and rewrites. But I think we can't just change language without explaining why. So these rewrites need to have context. They need to have disclaimers in perhaps an age-appropriate tone to provide kids and the adults reading with them with the context as to why the decisions are made to rewrite the novels, if that's what publishers truly want to do.
I mean, I think a lot of parents are very split about this, Cindy, because, you know, to take myself as an example, when it comes to books written for grown-ups, you know, people have talked about rewriting Agatha Christie and Ian Fleming. I feel very strongly, you know, I studied English at university. No, those are books from the 1930s, 40s and 50s. People had what we now see as racist attitudes then. They were misogynistic. And if I want to read something from the 1950s, I actually want to be immersed in the 1950s and what people thought then. And I'm a grown-up, so if you want to put an editorial edition with a footnote, fine, do. But I would like to read the original text. But when I'm reading to my kids, and I have tried Enid Blyton, I have to do so much self-editing as I'm going along to prevent reading out, you know, N-words and W-words and all the rest of it, that actually I just think this is a kid's book. It's a stress for me to read it to them because on every page you have to censor. And I do just think the core of what I loved about that book when I was a child had nothing to do with those racial epithets. So it is just easier to buy a version knowingly that is appropriate for my child now.
Yeah, I think I could definitely see where you're coming from, Ollie. I think the thing is this then infringes on kind of art and censorship, right? Because Enid Blyton wrote it in that way, you know, that was the way it was meant to have been written. You know, it was very intentional. So yes, the consumer may not find it easy to consume, but do we censor art? I think that then comes into those kinds of questions, especially of literature of a certain age. As you say, you know, when it comes to adult fiction, the question is a no-brainer. I wonder if Enid Blyton is just one of those more inaccessible children's books. Maybe just don't start your kids on that. Maybe start them with Paddington or something, you know, and then when they're a bit older, you can have that contextual conversation with them and then read the kind of uncensored version to them. I mean, I have to say I haven't, you know, I grew up more with Paddington than with Enid Blyton, so I can't really say exactly how offensive it is. But I feel like maybe just there are some books that as parents, you're right, Ollie, that you just don't want to read your kids, and that's okay. That's your parents' prerogative. Can I just come back to the bulimia point as well, which is, I see a lot about what you and Jamie are saying here. I wonder if for me, the problem here is that for certain mental health issues like bulimia, if you're talking to them about these things to children under the age of 10, you know, it's likely that they don't have those issues. They don't know what they are. They haven't gone through puberty and they don't have the unrealistic body expectations that teenage girls have. So if it's not a problem, if it's not on their radar so far, I'm not sure I would actively teach them about it. You know, for teenage girls, I think you need to have that recognition of those mental health issues and all that sort of stuff. But if it's a children's book, then children are not thinking about bulimia and these mental health issues. And so I think it's less age appropriate than that. It's less about, oh, well, you're a parent, you don't have to do that. It's more, how should a society educate its kids? Don't burden your kids with things they're not worried about in the first place, is how I would say, for the first, at least when they're young.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, you know, adults and even slightly older children are likely to have developed the social awareness to understand topics like this, like Cindy's saying. They can rationalise them. But younger children don't necessarily have that cultural capital yet. So why don't we just shield them from these challenging topics up until an age where it becomes appropriate? Literature is so formative for young children. They're absorbing what they read, and whether they go on to actually do things or imitate what they're reading obviously is perhaps a bit more extreme, but there's no way that we can say that they aren't recognizing the themes, these troubling themes that are in literature.
I think Rebecca's right in some respects. I do have that feeling of like age appropriateness is down to the parent. I think that maybe potentially under 10s or, you know, under 11s might have mental health issues that they would like to see represented. You just don't know. I mean, individuals are completely different. I think as well, I've never been of the perspective that banning things from kids is the right way. I feel like if you want to encourage people to read and for reading to be less of a kind of anxious situation, we should be as open as possible with all of the different texts that exist and try and open kids' eyes to as many different worlds and things like that. I think I completely see that it's a kind of question for parents, and I'm pretty happy for this book from a personal perspective for this book to exist. I believe that probably in the context that it was written, it's important to have those issues discussed. I think it's a question of personal, personal where you draw the line, really.
Except we're talking about massive international brands when we're discussing some of these dead authors, Rebecca. You know, it's all very well to say like, oh, it's up to you whether you buy the book or not. But I mean, if you own the estate of Roald Dahl or Enid Blyton, that's a massive international business. I mean, of course, you're going to make your product, which is those books and that intellectual property, relevant to children for as long as you possibly can. That's capitalism.
No, absolutely. And I think we'd be kind of foolish or perhaps naive to say that there isn't some sort of financial motivation behind this. I mean, obviously, Roald Dahl and Enid Blyton and authors of their day have such an enduring brand. And as, you know, older people, we take those authors with us through our lives and memories of that. But I don't know. I think the good thing is that there are an estimated 10,000 children's books being published in the UK every year. So we can cherish those classics, but still view them as what they were of their time and move on and perhaps combine children's reading with new authors who perhaps are a bit more sensitive to issues of the day.
Well, that is as close as we're going to get to a fairy tale ending today. My thanks to Jamie, Rebecca, and Cindy. You can follow this show for free and get every episode as soon as it's released by searching for The Week Unwrapped wherever you get your podcasts. Just tap follow. You can also get 6 free issues of The Week magazine with a trial subscription if you go to theweek.co.uk/subscribe. In the meantime, I've been Olly Mann. Our music is by Tom Morby, the producer, Sophie King at Rethink Audio. I'm off to Spain now on holiday, but have no fear, Arian will be here to unwrap the next couple of weeks for you. Until then, adios.